So this lecture is a lecture not so much actually about the period between 400 and 600 per se, but about how one constructs arguments for interpreting that period. So that's really where we're going to be going over the course of the evening. The earliest evidence for the English dates to the mid-6th century. It's really one of the greatest puzzles of British cultural history, how the English emerged. The Roman administration and armies were withdrawn sometime in the very early 5th century, it's assumed, and yet by 600 AD, people were writing laws in the English language, and by the mid-6th century, they were calling themselves English. So in about in about 552, an embassy of Franks to Justinian, the Byzantine emperor, included within it a group of people who called themselves English, and who came from what is now Britain. Half a century later, the laws of King Ethelbert of Kent, which are supposed to be, or they're the earliest, I should say, they're the earliest known documentary record of the English language. There might have been things written in English before, but these are the ones that we know about as being the earliest. And the laws are really interesting because laws at that time were agreed orally. Communities had to heard the laws, they remembered them, they were explained to them, and they, in order to hear them, because most people didn't speak Latin, they were spoken in they were written and spoken in the words that most people understood. So the fact that these laws are written in English is enormously significant. But nobody really knows how it happened that in that short interval of 200 years, between 400 and 600, a group of an identity had emerged in which people described themselves as English, spoke a language which we call Old English. The kind of cultural identity had emerged. How did this happen? Well, there are broadly two interpretations, two narratives for this. The first is that there was mass immigration. This is a rather cheeky illustration from Warhammer, but it gives the impression. It shows King Arthur, if you believe in him, which I have to say I don't, but it shows King Arthur fighting against immigrants from Northwest Europe. So the first is that there was mass immigration. That is now largely discounted because the population of Britain in about 400 numbered between 3 and 5 million people. And so whatever the numbers of people migrating into the country in that period, they cannot have been enough to completely overcome such a large existing population. And when that large population became known, a new narrative emerged, and that was, it's called elite replacement. And basically what it means is that leaders in these migrant groups from Northwest Europe took over the roles of Romano-British leaders. So if somebody was running an administrative unit, whether it was a city or a town or simply a village or a region, then it is supposed that people from Northwest Europe took over. So those are the two principal narratives for explaining the emergence of the English, and those are the ones that I really want to interrogate over the coming 45 minutes or so. There are a number of problems with those narratives, and this is just one of them. The first is that it has an incredibly simplified version of history. So it's basically one of cause and effect. So the cause is the imperial withdrawal from Britain, because clearly nobody could take over Britain if the Romans were already there. So once the Romans had left, there was supposed to be, and I really emphasize supposed to be, a power vacuum. So the imperial armies and administration withdrew, and the effect is supposed to have been political, economic, and social instability. That is, there was a disaster. The next thing that happened was that there were migrations from Northwest Europe. Remember, this is a narrative. I'm not telling you this is true. I'm telling you this is the story. Migrations from Northwest Europe. And the effect was that there was elite replacement of existing leadership and dominance of Germanic culture, which led to salvation. Everything was going to hell in a handcart, and as immigrants arrived, and then everything achieved a kind of stability. This is an incredibly simplified model. And by the time we get to the end of this session, I hope to show you a rather more complex model, which I think is perhaps more likely, but in itself, it's also only a model. So what I'm planning to do over the coming 45 minutes or so is to say something by way of introduction. I want to look at the evidence, documentary evidence, archaeological, genomic, and linguistic, for sufficient migration from Northwest Europe to make it a cultural impression, and then going to draw some conclusions. So that's roughly speaking where we're going to be going. So I'd like to start by saying something about interpretations. Then I'm going to discuss my premises, and then I'm going to show you the questions that I hope to interrogate, that we're going to be asking during this lecture. So about interpretations. Well, now, this is J.M. Waterhouse's painting of the Lady of Shalott from Tennyson's very well-known poem. And as you remember, the Lady of Shalott wasn't allowed to look out of the window. If she looked out of the window, her doom would come upon her. And she was only able to see what was going on in the world outside her, outside the window, by looking in the mirror where it was reflected. What she saw in the mirror, she then turned into tapestries. Now, the analogy is with historians and archaeologists. We can't experience the past at first hand. If we can't time travel, we don't know what it was like there. We make a best guess. All the material we have at second hand, what has survived. And then we try to interpret it, and that is our third hand narrative. So we're no better than the Lady of Shalott. When she saw Sir Lancelot coming Tiralera along the river, with his black locks and his shield shining and everything, she instantly fell in love with him. So perhaps, we don't know, but perhaps at that point she thought he was coming to rescue her from the tower, and that was why she rushed down to meet him. But actually, you and I know very well that he was either on his way to the Round Table at Camelot, or that he was going to Camelot for a tryst with Guinevere, but this Lady of Shalott could not have been further from his mind. So she was making assumptions. She was basing her actions on a premise about what she thought he was thinking, but actually those premises were wrong. So I'm going to explain my premises to you. These are the things I'm going to take for granted. The first is that there was continuous immigration into Britain since the end of the last Ice Age. In fact, that continues today. The population in about 400 is, as I say, believed to have been between 3 and 5 million. By about 600, we have no idea what it was. We don't know what the demographic changes were over that period. But there has been continuous immigration. And what that means is that there was demographic continuity. The people who had been living here in about 400 had children and grandchildren who continued to occupy the land across the following 2 or 3 centuries, among whom immigrants were assimilated, because immigrants were constantly arriving in the country in the same way that people were leaving to go somewhere else. There's population movement across the Channel and across the North Sea throughout the last millennia. So those are my 2 premises, the things I'm taking for granted. So the questions that I'd like to ask are, was there a change in the volume of migratory flow? Because if we want to attribute a cultural change to immigrants, we have to show that there was a change, either have to show that there was a change in the numbers of people who migrated, or we have to show that there was a change in the regions from which most people came. That is, if we can show that most people before 400 came from all over Europe, including Southern Europe, Northern Europe, perhaps even further away, as archaeology has shown, did that change between 400 and 600 in that a large majority of immigrants came from Northwest Europe? So was there a change in the volume of flow, Was there a change in the places they came from? And was there a significant cultural impact as a consequence of that immigration? So those are the three questions going to be asking. And the method that I'd like to adopt is two. So first is forget the story, forget what we think we know. Just look at the evidence, see what it says, and see where it takes us. If we start interpreting the evidence in terms of what we think has happened, then perhaps what we're going to do is skew the answer. And that isn't really going to be terribly helpful, because then we're just making an answer we expect to find. So pretend we know nothing. We're starting from scratch. And the second is the law of Occam's razor. So it's my favorite cartoon. The law of Occam's razor assumes that the model which is, the law of Occam's razor is that the model which makes the fewest assumptions is likely to be the most reasonable. So if you can't prove your assumptions, if you can't prove your premises, then you need to make an argument which makes the fewest. The more unfounded assumptions you make, the less likely your argument is likely to hold. So if you're going to say, well, if this, and then if that, and then if something else, and then if yet another thing, then by the time you get to your well then, you're making a conclusion which stands at the top of a house of cards. So those are my two principles. So let's have a look at the evidence for widespread immigration into this country from Northwest Europe between 400 and 600. We're going to look at the documentary, the archaeological, the genomic, and the linguistic. So I'm going to start with the documentary. Now, this is an enormously rich subject. I could talk to you about the documentary evidence and all the others for an hour each or more. I haven't got time to do that this evening, so I'm going to skate over the surface. But if you have questions about any of these sources, please ask me about them afterwards, and I'll be really, really happy to talk to you about them. The two contemporary sources that we have from that period are the Lives of St. Patrick, a memoir written by Patrick himself, and the Sermons of Gildas, who was a fire and brimstone preacher of the early 6th century. So now Patrick was born somewhere probably in Western Britain. He was born towards the end of the 4th century. He was kidnapped and taken to Ireland, from whence he escaped, came back to Britain, perhaps in about 430 or so. So now Patrick wrote his memoirs when he was an old man. And what it reveals is that he came from a world which was intensely Romanized. He thought of himself as a Roman. He came from a family which spoke vernacular Latin, which his father's name was Calpurnius, a Latin name. He was a citizen of Rome. He was a deacon in the Roman Christian church, and he was a decurion, part of the town council of the town in which, he was a decurion in the town which lay near to his villa, the other way around, where I got tongue-tied. So now when Patrick talks about his home in that period, he talks about his decision to go back to Ireland. And he says how sad his family were to see him go. And he doesn't say they were sad to see him go because the world was in turmoil and they needed him, then a young man, to defend him against what was going on around them, against immigrants, against civil war, any of those things. No, they simply were sorry to see him go because they loved him. And the world that he describes is one in which there are landowners, there's Christianity, there's a proper church, there's regional administration, there are hierarchical institutions which govern mid-5th century Britain in the same way, they think, as they were administered, say, 50 or 60 years before. And it's quite possible they were administered in the same way, but it's equally possible that institutions had evolved slightly over that 2 or 3 generational period. So there's no evidence in Patrick's memoirs of what is called the Adventists, the arrival of people from Northwest Europe. When you look at Gildas, Gildas saw himself also as a Roman, and he was absolutely appalled at slipping standards. So his whole diatribe is about people who are forgetting how true Romans live, and they're abandoning the standards of proper behavior, and God's punishment is going to be visited upon them. So when you read Gildas and you look for evidence of the Adventus, you don't find it. The wars are all with the Picts from Scotland or the Scots from Ireland. There's, I think, one mention of Saxons attacking with Picts, as it happens. Gildas uses his material twice over, so it looks like 2 attacks, but actually is only 1. And when you look in behind the rhetoric at what he's actually describing in early 6th century Britain, he describes judges with courts and prisons. He describes a military hierarchy continuing to use late Roman methods of organizing and managing troops. He describes civic administration. He describes a church hierarchy of bishops and priests with churches and monasteries and monks. And he describes the wealth and prosperity of the landscape, a productive landscape, which is fertile. There's really nothing in Gildas which supports the idea of an Adventus. The third source that one finds is, of course, the Venerable Bede. Now, Bede's history was written in 731, nearly 150 years after the events that he was describing. All his evidence for that period between 400 and 600, historical evidence, is drawn from Gildas. The other evidence he uses are praise songs from royal courts of his period, oral traditions, those sorts of things. There's no firm evidence that Bede can find to confirm anything that Gildas says, or to take anything that Gildas says any further. And Professor Sims Williams says Bede adds very little and still less of real value. His text is of value only for what can be inferred from it of dynastic, heroic, and topographical tradition. That is, from the sources that he consulted, which were oral sources and which had a propaganda value. There is then no reliable contemporary documentary evidence for substantive invasion, settlement, or conquest from Northwest Europe in any of the insular sources. So that takes us then to continental sources. And once again, there are a lot of them. Most of them have only brief notes about Britain in them. So I'm not going to talk about them for the same reason. It's not enough time, but I would like to say something briefly about Constantius's life of St. Germanus of Auxerre. So now Constantius's life is said to have been written around about 480, although Dr. Philip Bartholomew thinks it might have been written perhaps half a century earlier. St. Germanus was sent by the Pope to Britain in 429 in order to deal with a heresy which had arisen in the British Church. And he came, he visited, he took part in a campaign against an attack by Picts and Saxons. But the world that he describes is once more the same as that of Patrick. He describes recognizably late Roman institutions, administrative structures, military hierarchies and organization, churches, church hierarchies, shrines, monasteries, and monks. And he says, a most wealthy island, rendered secure in every sense by his repelling of this attack from the north. So all the evidence, the documentary evidence shows, is the continuing evolution of Romano-British institutions across the 5th and 6th centuries. They're still recognizable. There's no documentary evidence for the Adventus. This isn't to say that things remained the same, but it is to say that there was no noticeable break. So, what does the documentary evidence add then to any of the 3 questions that we've asked about volume, about origin, and about cultural impact. Well, actually, they don't. We just don't know. There's nothing that they add that is useful to us. So then we come to landscape archaeology, the first of our archaeological areas. So my field is landscape archaeology, and this is just an example of long-term continuity in the landscape. So here, this orange line is a Roman road running from northwest to southeast, and you can see that it crosses here a square, rough square, which has been divided by the road into two triangles. Now, it's very unlikely that a farmer would make a triangular field, and so archaeologists generally recognize that when one sees that sort of feature, that what you're looking at is a unit which has been subdivided. If you only had that square, actually you couldn't claim anything on it because it's too small. You need more than one. So look here, see all these roughly west-east boundaries on the same alignment as that square. See how they go along. And they also appear on this axis from northwest to southeast, which are on the same alignment as the side boundaries of our unit. This is a prehistoric field system. It was there before the Romans arrived and continued to be used well into the Middle Ages. You can see these field boundaries are the boundaries of medieval open field furlongs. There's no sense of any break between Roman and early medieval in the arable landscape. And the same is true of the pastoral landscape. There are very many places across Britain on the highlands where the mosaics of grasses that have been, that cover those areas remained more or less the same across at least 2 or 3 millennia. And what you're finding when you find that kind of continuity of ground cover is deliberate management of the landscape to make it that way. If that had not happened, if there had been a break, with pollen evidence ought to show that woodland had regrown, at least for a time, and then been cut down again. There's nothing like that. And this is Professor Terry O'Connor saying that what you're seeing is deliberate management across at least 2 millennia. So there's no sense in the arable or the pastoral landscape of any break between the end of the Roman period and about 600. There are places, obviously, where it did happen, but by and large, the default position is that there isn't a break. So then when it comes to burial archaeology, well, now here in Oakington, there's a cemetery, a very well-known cemetery, excavated, dates to between 500 and 800 AD. And if you look at all the graves, you can see they're all on the same alignment. They all shared the same grave goods. There's nothing to distinguish one burial from another. So they did some genomic research on 4 of the burials, and they found that one, which is the orange one I've highlighted in orange, was somebody whose DNA went back into prehistoric Britain. And the second one, number 3, in the blue, is somebody who shared partly prehistoric DNA with partly DNA from Northwest Germany, but then you'd expect migration, so it doesn't prove the adventus. And then the third, the 2 green ones are later. They're around 800, well after the adventus, and they do come from Northwest Europe. There's nothing here to show that incomers are identifiable by location, burial rite, or their grave goods. So where is the elite replacement? It's not visible. Actually, the adventus isn't visible either. Similarly, there's this burial, the cemetery from near Ely. Here we have a young woman in a very rich grave, buried in a barrow, and the burials around it are all sharing the same orientation, but isotope analysis from the enamel in their teeth shows where they grew up. And what it reveals is that the woman, the girl at the center of the barrow, and some of the people around her came from somewhere else in Britain. There are a few locals in brown. There's some from Europe, but I think only one came from Germany and he came from Bavaria. And then there are 2 who come possibly from North Africa, but perhaps just somewhere in the southern Mediterranean. And once more, the incomers are unidentifiable by the location of their graves, their burial right, or their grave goods. There is an elite burial here, but it's not of someone from Northwest Europe. And those who are from outside Britain are not being buried all in the same place. Then you're not getting clusters where, you know, all the French are buried in one corner and all the Italians in another. People are being buried around the burial. There's no sense of segregation. So once more, immigrants are coming in and they're being assimilated. When we come to the material archaeology, well, there are two strands to be drawn together here. The first is about continuity of technology and artistry from late Roman Britain. So, for example, on the left, there's a pot, a wheel-thrown pot from a 6th century grave in Bedfordshire. Many of you will know that actually wheel-thrown pots are meant to stop being manufactured in about 400, but that's increasingly now being challenged. And the form of that pot is one of the 1st century AD. So it's a traditional form, wheel-thrown, but it's been buried in a 6th century grave. And you can tell that it's a 6th century pot because the clay that made it is different from the clay of the 1st century. The second is the escutcheon from the Sutton Hoo hanging bowl. Here, enameling is a Romano-British tradition. And if you look into it, you can see the great whirls of late Iron Age art, you know, things like the Battersea Shield and so on. You can see them being repeated in that escutcheon. So there's continuity of technology, of craftsmanship, of ideas about aesthetics, all moving from the 5th century into the 6th century and on to the 7th. This isn't to say they are the same in 600 as they were in 400. That clearly cannot be the case. History doesn't work like that. But what I'm saying is there's evidence of evolution, of adaptation, of innovation across that period. The third item is this urn in the middle, which comes from Lincolnshire. It's in a classic so-called Anglo-Saxon form. So when one finds these jars and urns, are they evidence of ethnicity? That is, do they show where the Anglo-Saxons settled? Well, let me show you an analogy. This is from the work of Leeds, who did some very interesting work in 1945. It's a bit outdated now, but the general premise remains the same. So for Leeds, I'm sorry, I should have said this map is obviously of the North Sea upside down. And the point of putting it upside down is to emphasize how the rivers from Northwest Europe flowed into the North Sea and gave direct access by river into the hinterland, of central, even parts of southern England, and of course the north. And then straight away from Norway or from what is now Denmark and so on. And this is because, as everybody knows, the Anglo-Saxons are supposed to have rowed their boats up the rivers and settled inland because they didn't like the fens. So Leeds proposed that if one could find where early Anglo-Saxon brooches were, or other evidence of material culture, very early, then what one was also looking at was primary settlement of Anglo-Saxons from Northwest Europe. So he has a premise that ethnicity is an index of material culture, that you can tell someone's ethnicity from the things that they use. So here's another map. This map is of IKEA stores in England in 2018. Well, now let's imagine that we're 2,000 years from now, 4021, and that all documentary evidence of our period has disappeared, unlikely though it may seem. The archaeologists of our 4021 will be finding these IKEA stores, and what they'll find are concentrations, high concentrations of IKEA stuff. And they might then say, oh yes, well, obviously it's invasion of Scandinavians, in the late, I can't go backwards from here, let's see, but anyway, but you know, from basically from the late 19th, sorry, the 20th century into the 21st, and that they built these central places from which they distributed their goods as gifts or ways of achieving patronage or winning favor with powerful lords, that they had these central places, and that as one sees, the further you go away from the IKEA stores, the volume of IKEA stuff diminishes, and that is because obviously the further you go away, there were fewer people who were in contact with these very powerful elites who were running the stores. So there we have ethnicity as an index of material culture. But you and I know very well that this is nothing of the sort has happened. I mean, you could argue, look, we even went up the rivers, but we know that didn't happen. We know this is simply evidence of trade. So I'm not saying that the fact that the material culture changes so significantly after 400, that it didn't happen as a consequence of migration. Maybe it did, but equally well, it may not. And if you don't prove the premise first, then you can't claim the narrative. We have to make sure that none of the other explanations work before we can adopt ethnicity as the explanation for the change in material culture. So was there a change? Did people come from somewhere different? Was there a cultural impact? Well, actually, we just don't know, because that case has not been proven. I'm not saying it didn't happen. Maybe it did, but also maybe it didn't. And if we assume that it did, then we're locking ourselves into a virtual box. We're just making things up until we can prove the premises that we're working from. So then the genomic evidence. Well, there's a very famous study in 2016. This is published in Line on 2015, where a group decided they were going to try to use European DNA to look at the history of genomes in Britain, and they would try to show whether or not there had been an adventus. So they're very excited because then they found, so I'm trying to get my mouse to work. So they found here in central England, which is what this line shows, which is where the most Germanic immigrants are supposed to have settled. They did find a reasonable Germanic imprint. So they were quite happy with that, and they were able to claim as a consequence that the proportion of Germanic DNA in the modern British population was something between 10 and 40%. The trouble is, if you look down that line a bit further, you see that blue bar there. That's the French. And if you look at the supplementary material where they explained what they did and why they did it, they say, they admit that the French, which is about French contribution, about 3 times greater than that of the German. But they say, well, we decided not to count it because Bede didn't say that the Saxons came from France. So, excuse me, but you just can't do that. You know, this is meant to be a scientific method. You can't say, well, I'm not going to have that material because it doesn't suit my argument. I'm just going to leave it out. You have to put the uncomfortable stuff in with the comfortable. And had they done it, actually, they might have just, you know, that could have been a jolly good story. It could have been, look at the volume of French DNA. How are we going to explain this? We're going to have to think of a new way of looking at the history of Britain between 400 and 600. Would that not have been exciting? But they didn't do that. And it's a very disappointing result. There is a second problem about reconstructing DNA from ancient DNA from modern DNA. In Iceland, everybody has on their app, on their phones, an app that shows how closely related they are to everybody else in Iceland. Because clearly, if you're going to start going out with someone in Iceland, you don't want to marry somebody who's genetically too close to you, because obviously, you know, children will be affected. So Icelandic scholars compared modern Icelandic DNA, the full range of modern Icelandic DNA, with the full range of 9th century Icelandic DNA. And they found that the modern DNA only represents about half of what was available from the 9th century onwards. I mean, people, lines die out, there are Darwinian accidents and so on. But nonetheless, it's very dodgy to cast back from the modern period to the past in this way, because you're only hitting half of the population, the old population. There are other critiques as well, but again, no time. So then in 2016, a German laboratory undertook what ought to have been quite an innovative piece of work, where they took the Oakington Cemetery, which is over here, and they said, I wonder if we measure change across the period, we will find whether we'll be able to identify the Adventists. That was a jolly good idea. So what did they do? They chose a late Iron Age population over here and compared it and we end up with this one up here from Hinkston. So the maximum period that they were measuring change across was from 300 BC until 800 AD. That's nearly 1,000 years. Why did they not take a late Romano-British cemetery? They're 2 a dozen, 20 a dozen. Then you could measure change from there to here. That would be a good thing to measure, but this only measures migration from the end of the Iron Age, the late Iron Age, right until the early 9th century. Alternatively, you could say, well, let's look at the minimum period they measured. The minimum period they measured, the whole of the Romano-British centuries, a whole 400 years, and then up to about 600 or 650. But once again, what they can't measure is what they wanted to measure, which was the bit from 400 to 600. So once again, it doesn't leave us any the wiser. So as far as the genomic evidence is concerned, was there a change in where people came from and their numbers? Actually, we just don't know. We still don't know. Maybe new genomic evidence will demonstrate it, but the current evidence does not. And finally, language. So the one thing people usually say to me is, aha, they say, but what about Old English? You can't get away from that. That's the killer blow to your argument. So let's just have a look at that. There are 2 competing explanations for the origins of English. The first is that it was introduced by a small dominant Northwest European elite. So this is the elite dominance or elite replacement model, who spoke Old English and refused to speak anything else, which they learned as, so local people then learned it as a second language because they were subservient to the new overlords. And because they aspired to upward mobility and patronage and wealth, they thought they'd better speak the language of the people who ruled them. That's language 1. But as we've seen, sorry, I should start again. There isn't any evidence for late Romano-British subservient communities. There isn't any. Furthermore, the migrants who came into Britain came from lots of different places. They didn't all come speaking the same language. So Old English emerged in England itself, not abroad. So there's a second explanation, and that is that Old English had evolved from a dialect which is called North Sea Germanic by about 600 AD. So now I've colored in roughly the coastlines, but of course these languages were spoken further inland on the continent itself. Whether or not they were spoken further inland in Britain, we don't know. But this is the indicative extent of North Sea Germanic before about 600 AD, and it's based on the work of Professor Peter Schrijver at the University of Utrecht. So he suggests that English had evolved in this. It was a contact language. It wasn't a language of conquest, had nothing to do with elite replacement. It was learned through contact with other speakers, not just one speaker, but lots of other speakers, and that the people who spoke it were already bilingual or multilingual in one or more of the languages of sub-Roman Britain. So they could speak late spoken Latin, and they might have been able to speak Brittonic. And then they learned Old English as well. And then they incorporated into their use of Old English elements from Brittonic and from late spoken Latin. So this has got nothing to do with conquest, and it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with migration on any scale at all. It could simply be our IKEA model. So why did Old English become dominant? Well, firstly, it could have been the language of a new immigrant elite, but we've rather largely discounted that. Or it had a specific functionality. And we can see some evidence for that in these two maps, which you can see the first one here. So this is the percentage of English speakers in Europe. The aim of this is to show that ethnicity and language are not necessarily correlated. Old English might not necessarily have been spoken by people from Northwest Europe. So here, if you look at Western Europe, you can see that a large proportion of people, especially in Scandinavia, in Denmark, Germany, and the Netherlands, can speak English. And they don't speak English because the British have invaded and insisted that they talk English. And they don't speak English because the British have gone over in small numbers and replaced the heads of their institutions. They speak English because they think it's useful. And here's another example, Swahili. Swahili originated on the northeast coast of Zanzibar. And the map shows where it originated, where it's now spoken as the national language of a country or a region, and in light green where it's used as, where people are bilingual using Swahili as a trading language. Then our Swahili is a language which emerged through trade, not through conquest. The link between Swahili and ethnicity doesn't exist. So I'm not saying it didn't happen in Britain. Perhaps it did. But we don't know that it did unless we look at all the possibilities and then rule them out. So why did it become dominant? It had a specific functionality, that's a possibility. Professor Shriver says it has a linguistic advantages over other languages. He says it has, it's more tolerant of people making mistakes than other languages. I'm not a linguist, I can't tell you if that's true or not, but it's something to think about. So when we look at Old English, what do we know? It wasn't a consequence of conquest or of dominance. Was it a consequence of more general migration? Well, actually, we just don't know. So when one looks at our questions as a whole, we look at the evidence that we've examined, what are the answers to any of those questions? The answers to each of them are the same, that we just don't know. If we really want to know, then we're actually going to have to start making better arguments. We're going to have to start looking at the premises, proving the premises, then building the arguments on things that are absolutely solid, rather than making things up on the basis of premises that are unfounded. So, like the Lady of Shalott, or rather unlike the Lady of Shalott, we need narratives that are constructed on the basis of things about which we can be certain. If we don't do that, then actually we're going to run into trouble. We can't be sure of the premises, and we can't be sure that the evidence really shows what we want it to show, or what we hope it will show, or even what does it show. Then we run the risk of just falling into creative writing at some point. We absolutely have to make good arguments. So I suggest another way in which history can be interpreted. And this comes from a wonderful little book by Gunderson and Holling, but basically it's Holling's work, where he suggests that historical change happens in quite a complex way. So he says, first, there are very long and slow processes. This is change over time. Very long, very slow, very large scale. For example, things like agriculture, things like what Pierre Bourdieu called habitus, the assumptions on which we base our social lives. And they change very, very slowly because they're inarticulate. They're underpinned by memory and tradition. And the other end of the scale, there are small changes, very fast changes, things that are quick, over very quickly. Sometimes they have have just a momentary impact. Other times they might have a longer term impact. And they feed into medium-term change, where there are things like climate change, and the effects of memory, the conservative effects of memory underlying the whole thing in the background, with short-term effects in the foreground and medium-term in the long time, in the middle, gives us a way of thinking about change in a far more complicated way. So if we're looking at our period, you could be seeing, for example, common property rights, common rights, the way that they were governed, the agricultural economy, ideas about what it meant to be Roman, which we can see in Gildas in the early 6th century, and actually even in the Sutton Hoo collection. In the use of later spoken Latin well into the 8th and 9th centuries, in Romano-British craftsmanship, which we've discussed. And at the fast end, there's the withdrawal of Roman administration, there are attacks from overseas, there's the Justinianic plague, all sorts of things. The pandemic that we're undergoing is perhaps similar to that plague. And then in the medium term, there are things like climatic change, a shift to trading across the North Sea rather than from the Mediterranean. And all those things are evidenced in changes in material culture, in the evolution of administrative structures, in changes in the expressions of personal identity and status, in developments in social hierarchies, and in people identifying as Angli or English. This is a complicated form of history, and it's a more interesting one than the cause and effect that I showed you at the outset. So what are my conclusions given the evidence? The first is that there was long-term stability, evolution, and adaptation of late Romano-British institutions, culture, languages, and society. Not stasis, not things remaining the same, things changing. In the context for a growing preference for things that came from across the North Sea. And that's as strongly as it can be put. And the picture there is of King Ethelbald of Mercia. And I've put him up because Professor and Dr. Biddle suggested that he has a multicultural identity. So he's wearing Roman chainmail and a Roman military skirt. He's facing the audience in a way that echoes the Byzantine emperors as shown on their coins. He's got a Germanic cerx. He has a little Celtic sword. He's got a little Celtic moustache. He has a diadem, although you can't see it, which is also drawn from Byzantium, and quite long hair, which they think could also be Celtic. So he's not fussed about being English. He's not fussed about being Anglo-Saxon. He doesn't really care about whether something is Byzantine or whether it's Roman or whether it's Germanic or whether it's Celtic. All those elements together make up his identity. And I think that's the kind of thing that we might be looking at when we start really looking at what happened in the period between 400 and 600. So that's the end. Thank you.